So in this presentation, I want to answer a question, and it concerns the differences between teaching English learners and teaching non-English learners. I know that all of us, to some degree or another, are language learners. But the question that I want to address is this one: is it really just good teaching? And I think this is an important question because I think that when we say that teaching ELs is really just good teaching, we're masking some of the major differences that exist between learning a first language and learning English in particular as a second or as a foreign language. And the danger is that good teaching, quote unquote, can be used to mask these differences, ignore these differences, and maybe do things on the cheap. And so I want to get some thoughts from my students on this question. But in order to do that, we have to have a little bit of a presentation on it, so let's do that. So the question about whether or not this is just good teaching, the first thing to consider is the critical period. And the critical period exists perhaps for both first and second language learners, but it's most noticeable, of course, with second language learners. And that is one main difference, I think. A place to begin certainly is with looking at the critical period. Another difference is developmental sequences. Both native speakers of English and second language learners are going to go through developmental sequences, but often they go through them at different times, and I think this has an impact, a big impact on instruction, and especially on the types of errors that we see. There's also the issue of language transfer, where your second language learners, your English learners, are going to approach learning English with a complete linguistic system in their first language. And that is something that is a big difference between learning English as a first language and learning English as a second language. You have this competing phonology, for example, and a competing syntax to contend with that can both help and hinder development, depending on how it's used, how it's understood, and how it's viewed in the classroom. The other is the acquisition versus learning distinction that I do believe exists. It's hard maybe to operationalize this as we learned when we were looking at Krashen, but I think that it does exist, and it can affect instruction. And it makes a difference. It's a difference between instruction that's for English learners and just good instruction in general. And then finally, the last thing to consider with regard to English language learners is that they face language restrictions that other learners are not going to face, or not going to face to the degree that your English learners will encounter. So let's go over these, and then I want to get your thoughts. So let's talk about the critical period first, if we could. And so I want to just remind you that there is a native proficiency clock that starts ticking, and that clock begins ticking, probably from birth up until about age 15, and there are a number of hypotheses and theories about the critical period. One of which is brain lateralization, that prior to the age of 15, you have a window of opportunity where someone can learn their first language and learn it as a native learns it, and become very proficient with it and expert in the language, as all of us are now, unless we learned the language after the age of 15. After the age of 15, then, you're facing a critical period that can affect the degree to which you sound like a native speaker of that language. And so this is one difference between the English learner and your typical language learner, let's say, whose first language is English and they're trying to learn the language of a content area or something like that. It tends to be most obvious in phonology. When you have a second language learner of English who learned it after this critical period, you do tend to wind up with an accent. Now, one thing that I've tried to convey to you throughout this class is that everybody's got an accent, regardless of whether or not English is your first language, your second language, etc. Everybody's got one, and that's the other reason that I gave you some information about different English varieties that are spoken all over the country, that what varies from region to region certainly are the accents, but also the perceptions of them. I think, if you remember, I tried to have you find the dentist, and we never did, because nobody sounded like one. But it's much more than that. It's our perceptions of what these phonologies sound like that affect our perceptions of them. That is also true of English learners. English learners typically are going to end up with an accent. It's most evident in phonology, but that can also affect grammar and the way that the language is spoken. Even if it's intelligible, there may be things that affect the pronunciation but also the construction of sentences in English, where you might hear where Chris is for where is Chris or something like that, and that may be subject to a critical period. Some other things that may not be so obvious too, beyond phonology or beyond the grammar of the language, might also be in terms of semantics and meaning. I know in Spanish, for example, that there are time demarcations in Spanish that are baffling to me. The simple past versus the long-term past is a distinction that I just reduce to the simple past because it's easy for me, because it conveys the meaning just fine. Like estaba is something that I will never use. That's like used to, or used to was, I guess. It's a time demarcation that is really not obvious to me, and so I don't use it. And people understand me, but what else do they learn? They learn that I'm not a native speaker of Spanish, and so some things just might be cut off from experience, or I just don't have the time to learn it. The other thing to consider with the critical period is this may also affect the word gap, especially for English learners. Let's imagine and remember that children who may not be experiencing a lot of words at home in English may not get that foundational vocabulary necessary to propel them through learning higher level vocabulary or higher level content, and that explicit instruction may be very necessary for them because of that word gap. But I want you to think about the English learner who's coming to the table trying to learn English as they're trying to learn content. Not only may they be facing the word gap that everyone else in the class is facing, but they're also trying to learn the language at the same time. Look, this is, to my mind, even more complicated. It's not impossible. It's a difference. And when we say things like, well, English learner instruction is just good teaching, it's ignoring something that we know exists, a critical period for phonology and other aspects of the language, but also the word gap. You know, if you're coming to the classroom with a language other than English, not only are you going to perhaps be behind those 20,000 words that we're looking for, 20 million, whatever that figure happened to be, not only are you behind everyone else in those words, but you're also trying to learn them as you're trying to learn how to communicate. It's a pretty tall order. If you have those words, however, in your first language, then you can take advantage of some of the features of the differences, like transfer, which I'll talk about in a minute. But this is, a difference that may not be obvious to the layperson. There may also be a continuum for you to think about with regard to English learners that I think falls outside to a degree of what we talk about when we talk about good teaching. There's explicit instruction on one end, and on the other, inductive instruction. Explicit, of course, will be targeting a lot of rote memorization, a lot of repetition, a lot of behavioral things. Your inductive instruction is one where you're trying to get the learner to think independently, work independently, become an independent learner. And maybe for English learners, when working in the second language, they're going to be working on the explicit side depending on their age. There are factors. There's age, for example. There's experience, for example. No experience may be more explicit instruction. Lots of experience, more inductive instruction. The difficulty of the task at hand. Learning how to factor a quadratic equation, if one even does that, would be hard for me because I'm a lit major. And maybe I would need explicit instruction early on to propel me toward inductive instruction. But the point is that for your English learners, this is a difference, I think, that exists between what we call good teaching for everybody and specific instruction for English learners. Now, this continuum could change if we did more L1 instruction. Maybe Maybe your second language learners, if they share a common first language like Spanish or Portuguese or Greek, could spend more time in inductive instruction and really becoming independent learners at the same time that they're spending time in explicit instruction to get up to speed on the English they need for basic survival or for content area reading, content area learning. But this is another difference, and it's a difference that I think that can be masked if we're not looking for these differences and considering them when we talk about good teaching versus good English learner teaching. Another area that I don't think can be ignored is the distinction between acquisition and learning. All learners, of course, start out at different places when we begin our instruction and design experiences for our students. But one consideration that I think needs to be factored into to our planning is this distinction between acquisition and learning. And I think it's another area that illustrates a difference between just, quote, good teaching, unquote, and instruction that is directed and purposed for English learners. So let's try to remember what this is all about. First of all, the first language is acquired naturally. If you have children or have been around them for any length of period of time, you know that they just absorb that first language. They're immersed in it. They're acquiring new words every single day, and they're learning it in an instance where explicit instruction is not as common as it becomes when one enters school. Now, certainly, parents or other caregivers do play games with the students. If the parent is a teacher, there may be explicit instruction that's going on, but that's not done 24 hours a day. Certainly, part of the day is spent sleeping, so there's at least 8 hours, if one is lucky, that we can subtract from that equation. And then there's a lot of play that goes into learning that first language up until about age 5. You know, the child is spending a lot of time with other kids the same age. Everybody's sort of fumbling through the language together and eventually sounding like native speakers of whatever English variety they happen to be learning. They sound like their speech community. When we talk about second language acquisition, well, maybe it's acquisition, but it's probably more along the lines of learning. That was certainly the case maybe for you if you talk French, for example, and there are very few French speakers around here unless your family spoke French. You were learning that in an unnatural way. Now, maybe some of the instruction modeled natural acquisition, where you're trying to use the language in real situations rather than memorizing lists of words or memorizing grammar or something like that. I talked about the communicative approach. And the communicative approach is exactly designed for that purpose, to try to teach the foreign language or the second language as naturally as possible. However, it's still occurring in a learning environment, and it is not then the same as learning your first language. We may try to make it as natural as possible, but it's still not the same. This is then another difference, to my mind, between good teaching for everybody and specific teaching for English learners. One thing that we, I think, need to consider if we have a high number of ELs in our classroom is that some of the instruction is going to be maybe a little bit unnatural and a little more difficult, and that should be factored into the planning, that we're not just trying to teach everyone as if these differences don't exist. They do exist, and they have to be taken into account. So as far as planning goes, this is a difference that I think is worth recognizing, and while all students may face explicit learning at some point, there is a but here. ELs may face explicit learning much earlier, and I think that does have some effect on the instruction and maybe even the motivation of students. You know, if you have to learn everything explicitly all the time, it can get to be a bit of a drag, as you can imagine. And finding new and novel and innovative ways to maintain learner engagement, especially when doing something that's slightly unnatural, that the rest of the class does not have to do, is an important difference. In other words, it's not just good teaching for everyone. There's good teaching, but that good teaching has to be contextualized. It has to be contextualized for the population who's the target of instruction. And there are differences, and I think they need to be recognized, and this is another area of that. Developmental sequences are another area I think that mark a difference between good instruction and good English learner instruction, and it's understanding that these sequences exist. And just to refresh your memory a little bit, all students are going to pass through these developmental sequences. If you're learning English as a first language or a second language, you're going to pass through different stages of development, and that's just seems to be the way it is. For whatever reason, our minds are either pre-structured with grammar, if you believe Chomsky, or the environment provides the structuring and structuring the neural networks if you're into more modern views of language acquisition. But regardless of whether Chomsky is correct or the neural network people are correct, it doesn't matter. What does matter is recognizing that all students are going to pass through developmental sequences. But there is a main difference, and that is this. Many English speakers in the classroom will have already completed these sequences. This is especially true with adolescents. By the time the child is approaching adolescence, those sequences tend to be finished, or if it's a feature of the speech community where it's acceptable for someone to say something like he's scared, or he here, or he not there, or something like that. It's maybe just a community decision, an unconscious one, that they're going to speak English that way. And then the child will sound maybe like they're still going through sequences, but they're not. It's a sociolinguistic phenomenon. But just to return to this point, by and large, your English speakers, if they're beyond the age of 7 or 8, will have completed their sequences by and large, and that is not the case with your English learners. In many cases, your English learners will only be starting the sequences. So imagine that, especially if you're an adolescent. If you're an adolescent, all the other children in the room have gotten through their developmental sequences, and you're just at the beginning. This can be embarrassing. It can be frustrating. It is a difference between just good instruction and good English learner instruction. There are undeniable psycholinguistic differences, and you're looking at one right here. For a refresher, this is most obvious in question orders and in phonological sequences. If we look at a phonological sequence first, for example, the S sound is special in English. It forms, for example, the plural, cars, and that's acquired before the possessive, Mike's. So you're going to get cars first and then Mike's cars. And it has to do with the level of concreteness, maybe, that plurals are more concrete than possessives, but nothing is as abstract as this, the third singular S. He runs, she runs, it walks, it runs. If I say it run, it walk, I'm communicating the same idea to you, and you still understand. The only difference, however, is I'm not a native speaker of English, or I speak a variety of English that many people would not consider standard and may look down upon. So there's some sociolinguistic things that go into this picture too. But imagine if you're 15 years old and you're learning English as a second language. All of the other 15-year-olds have gone through these sequences. They did so long ago, and here you are going to be sounding not only like a non-native speaker of English, but like you just make mistakes all the time. Every time you open your mouth is another mistake. Well, that's not because there's anything wrong with the child. It's because there's a sequence, and this, again, is a difference. We know this also from question orders. Like young children who are learning English as their first language pass through the where Chris is, where is Chris. There is also an order for do and did that I won't get into, but there are many orders of this nature that children go through, and they complete them. They complete them by between 5 and 7 years of age. Well, your English learners, depending on when they begin acquiring the language, may just be starting these sequences. And again, it can be quite frustrating. And for teachers who don't know that these sequences exist, and they're looking at the writings of English learners, for example, they may think that these kids don't know what they're doing, there's something wrong with them, when in fact, this error right here, where Chris is showing progress. And unless you know where to look for progress, you might be thinking that the child is learning absolutely nothing. So developmental sequences, to my mind, are a very important thing and a very important difference between good teaching and good English learner instruction. Language transfer is another area that marks a big difference between educating language learners in general, and language learners would be anybody in the class, and English learners in particular. Typically, your English learners are going to come to the table with a nearly complete phonological system. If they're beyond the age of 5 years old, if you're in the 7, 8, 9-year-old range, those phonological systems are pretty are becoming quite solidified. We know that the critical period will kind of take care of that by the age of 15. But when you have kids who are right around the just under the age of adolescence or in adolescence, they're already coming to the table with complete phonologies, grammars, syntax, vocabulary, etc. And so when they try to learn the second language, then they will be subject to things like positive transfer, which is good where the second language kind of gets a free ride. And you knew this when looking at cognates, for example, December and diciembre, for example, you get a free ride. If you know it in your first language, you can figure it out in your second language. That's a good thing. But there's also what we call false cognates, and this is part of negative transfer, where you get misconceptions and confusions, like embarazada means pregnant in Spanish, embarrassed means to feel shame in English. They look the same. I mean, wow, they even sound the same, but my goodness, are the words different. So it's not as if the first language is a problem for second language learners. There are positive aspects of it that can help, but there are also things that need to be considered, like these confusions or potential confusions between false cognates that English learners are going to encounter. And again, this is not just good teaching. This would be good English learner teaching. And I think that there is, as I'm trying to promote, a difference. Another thing that sort of ties these two things together, developmental orders and transfer, is what we call interlanguage analysis. If teachers were really skilled in this area, they might be able to see where a student's development is actually at when analyzing their errors. This is an example of negative transfer right here. We can say it's Japanese to English, and it's a fake example. I've got the citation at the bottom of the slide. If you want to go get it, you can. But in Japanese, the phonology does not permit closed syllables. So when a learner is trying to say dog, they might be saying most of the time dogu, and then half the time dagu, and then in the end they say dog. They finally get it right. This is an example of negative transfer where Japanese phonology is superimposed over English phonology, and that's where you get an accent from. Maybe eventually the learner will straighten it out and not say dagu anymore. But here's the interesting thing, that during L2 development, you might get developmental errors where the learner will be saying doc. Think about this for a minute. Most of the time in the beginning, that's what this continuum looks like. In the beginning, they say dagu, but half the time they say dagu, and the other half the time they say dak, or something like that. Because they know that saying dagu is wrong, so they try to approximate the phonology. Eventually, developmental errors start with nothing, they rise, and then they disappear. Transfer areas simply decline. Now, you might be saying to yourself, my God, this is too much to know, or it's too much to be practical, but it isn't. These things show up in writing a lot. If you're having students who are ELs writing a substantial amount of information that they're supposed to read and revise, I've seen this myself. I've seen interlanguage errors emerge in writing, and you can see where a child is stuck and precisely where they're stuck. If you see a lot of negative transfer errors, then you know the child is, or the learner, adolescent or adult, is really at the beginning stages of development, and that the problem they're having is mainly through negative transfer. What you really want to see are these very strange errors here, because those show more progress. It shows that the child is getting away from the first language and getting into the second language. It looks like the language is getting worse here, but it isn't. It's actually getting better. And a lot of that will show up in writing. This also shows up not just in writing when students are writing things out phonetically before they really know how to spell a word, but this will also happen with grammar and syntax. It'll happen with writing house white, using and imposing Spanish grammar over English, for example. You may not see, there's not much to talk about in terms of development with that example, but there are all other developmental errors that you'll notice with kids who are trying to figure out comma placement. Comma placement is different in Spanish, and so are quotations to a degree, the type of symbols that are used. Even in math, there's where the period and the comma go in a number that's got a hundredths, for example, will be different and can be subject to transfer. So it appears in many places. The point is that, again, this is something that's really the domain of the second language learner. It is a difference between what first language native speakers of English do with the language and something very special that second language learners do. So I don't think that we can just chalk this up to good teaching. That's, again, what I'm trying to promote. So when we're looking at interlanguage, having some understanding of how transfer errors fall over time and developmental errors rise then fall, and knowing what shows progress, it can look like the child's getting worse in the second language when in fact they're really getting better. So if I were to sum this area up a little bit for you, having teachers who really understand these differences so they know what they're looking at would really help quite a bit, because it may seem like the learner is getting worse when in fact they are actually getting better. So if I were to sum up transfer and development, English learners need time to acquire the language. 5 to 7 years is what the research says. But there are constraints too. It depends on when the student or when the child's learning this crazy English of ours. If it's after adolescence, it's not that we lower our expectations, but we have to understand that that critical period may be affecting and fossilizing that accent, and maybe we should be addressing it, that's true, but it may not be affecting their ability to write or listen or read, and so we might want to put some emphasis on those skills that are going to get us a lot more mileage, rather than worrying about an accent or something like that. You should also expect a silent period during acquisition. This happens with young people. Children will go through a silent period where they're not going to be saying much in the language, but this can also happen with adolescents too. And it could be because they feel shame or they feel like they don't want to be embarrassed in front of their peers. Maybe that's not such an issue with a 4 or 5-year-old, but with a 15-year-old, I think you can expect that there will be other challenges and embarrassments to go along with learning the language that perhaps can't be avoided, but we don't have to make it worse. And again, this is an idea that it's not just about good teaching. This is about good EL teaching. Certainly a safe environment is good for everyone, but this safe environment where people can make mistakes and are allowed to progress through a language, that's really about English learners. So teachers have to understand a whole different world, in a sense, that does not exist for the world of the native speaker of English. This is pretty much, this pertains really to English learners and learning English as a second or a foreign language. And it's a difference that I think can be masked if we just call everything good teaching. I think there's a lot more to it than just good teaching. So language restriction is the final area that I'd like to talk about. And Language restriction is something that I think is really uh, particular to educating English learners. English learners face policies that may or may not be reasonable, and the one that I'm thinking of first and foremost is 227, where the law says that you get 1 year of specialized instruction before you're to be mainstreamed, and we know that that is not really what's happening out there. Maybe there's some kind of foundation that occurs before the child is plopped into the classroom, and different schools will have different policies for what this looks like and what it means. But we are basically legislating against what may be a phenomenon that is unavoidable, that being 5 to 7 years is the amount of time that it takes for someone to learn this language. And so we do not impose these types of restrictions really on anyone other than your EL population. And I think that this is a difference, and it's a law, so we have to certainly comply with it. And that's the way that it is. Now, whether or not it's reasonable is another matter. This does point, again, to another difference between educating everybody, good instruction for everybody, and what good instruction means for English learners. When you get a law that is specifically crafted for you and your population, that doesn't exist for anyone else, that's a difference. And just to say good teaching means that perhaps this type of phenomena will be lost, or this notion will be lost, or this language restriction will be lost. The first language is a powerful skill, if we want to call the first language a skill. I did right here, so why don't we? That is a powerful skill that can aid content area teachers. If the child is quite proficient in the first language and understands metaphor and understands how to graph an equation and everything else, that can do nothing but benefit the content area teachers. So why we don't try to do more things with the L1 is a bit baffling to me. I'm not sure why we restrict and punish it. I think that we can maybe not use it as extensively in the classroom, to comply with the law, but nothing says that after-school programs can't be created to really promote L1 use and to promote development of academic concepts in that first language that then can be brought to the classroom, and maybe English and what the English equivalent of all those concepts happen to be would make more sense. So again, these are main differences to my mind. I'll sum it up for you this way. In my opinion, EL instruction certainly is about good teaching, but there are aspects that are different, and the differences really matter. It's not just a matter of saying, well, good EL instruction is just good teaching in general. I don't believe it. I don't think that good teaching can substitute for high quality English learner instruction. I think that good teaching is certainly good. I'm not advocating bad teaching for everyone else and good English learner instruction for ELs. I think good teaching for everybody is important. But I think if we ignore these differences, what we're essentially doing is using good teaching as a way to mask the differences that exist and are unavoidable. And it could lead to just English learner instruction on the cheap. We're just going to do good teaching for everyone, and we're not going to recognize the differences, because the differences exist, they matter. And I think that good EL instruction is something to strive for, and I think it is something that exists for a very specific population. We'll see what you think. Thanks for watching.